this evening. And if you have questions, just go ahead and jump them into the chat. So thank you, Allison.
Thank you, Krista. Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Okay, yes, great. I am so happy to be here, and let me just share my screen so we can get started. Can everyone see my first slide? Yes, okay, great. So it wouldn't be a beaver presentation without a pun for the word damn in the title. And I am thrilled to be here tonight. Krista gave a great introduction, but this is a little bit more about me. This is actually my second time giving a monthly program for PVIS. The last time was 5 full years ago, which is crazy, when I was an AmeriCorps volunteer and I was speaking about my graduate research, which was also on human-wildlife conflict, just a different focus species. I was studying monkeys then. And I will talk more about Human-Beaver Coexistence Fund, but thank you so much for having me tonight. Before we kind of get into the meat of the coexisting with beavers, first I'm going to take a sip of my tea here, and I want you all to notice my beaver mug. We're going to start off with some beaver basics, just so that we all know a little bit more, some foundational knowledge about the animal that we're talking about. So beavers are in the rodent family, which means that they have those characteristic long incisors there. And I don't know if you all remember the unscience an animal trend that was a few years ago, but this little graphic here is kind of my silly way of pointing out a lot of those beaver adaptations for the semi-aquatic life that they live. And you'll see the mouth axe there pointing to those characteristic rodent teeth. Their Latin name is Castor canadensis, and there is another species in Europe and Asia called Castor feber, and they're the Eurasian beavers, very similar to our North American beavers, just some few key differences. And you can see on the map here that beavers are pretty much distributed over most of the North American continent. They are herbivores, so they eat lots of different types of vegetation. A lot of people think that beavers eat fish, and that is not true. We can blame Lewis Carroll for that. I believe he wrote a story where beavers were eating fish. And then a lot of people think beavers just eat wood, and in fact, they like lots of other plant parts in addition to that inner bark of the trees that they chew down. A colony consists of anywhere between 4 and 10 individuals. They do form mated pairs. They stick together for many years and have new offspring every year. And so they could have up to 2 generations living with them in one colony at any given time before the 2-year-olds disperse. And like I mentioned, they're well adapted for a semi-aquatic lifestyle. So I'll also draw your attention to that tail, which they use to whack the water and communicate with each other if there is a predator or a threat nearby. It's actually very loud. The first time I heard that sound, I was pretty spooked, actually. So it would work for predators. They have webbed back feet, look a lot like duck feet that you can see there. And of course, their fur is something that they're also really well known for. It's the thing that almost completely wiped out their population in this country because of the fur trade. So they have nice, warm underfur, which felts very nicely into hats, unfortunately. And then they have the guard hairs on the outer part of the fur that keeps them nice and waterproofed. And they also have valves that can close their ears. They have extra eyelids. So all of this allows them to swim underwater. They can swim underwater with branches in their mouths. And they can also pop up above the water just enough so that their nose, eyes, and ears are above water. They can sense what's around them without being detected in a lot of cases. They live about 10 to 20 years longer in captivity, of course, like most animals. And their predators include, they don't have very many natural predators anymore in this area. maybe coyote, maybe bobcat, maybe a hungry black bear. But the biggest threat, I think, are the larger raptors that can take baby beavers, which are called kits, from the water when they're still pretty young and buoyant and they haven't learned how to quickly dive out of the way. And their current population is somewhere in the millions, which I admit is very vague. There used to be hundreds of millions before the fur trade that I mentioned, and now you'll see estimates anywhere between 2 and 15 million, but we don't really know for sure. It's certainly a fraction of what it once was, but of course there were far fewer humans back before the fur trade began, and a lot more available habitat for them, so that's something to consider. And then I just always like to clarify, so beavers are of course very busy builders. They build 2 different kinds of structures. The dam is what is going to turn a stream into a nice deep pond for beavers to have a safe place to escape from predators, to travel. They actually would prefer to travel by water than land. They're a little awkward on land. And the lodge is the structure that they build to actually live inside. So they'll build a dam first to create the pond, and then they'll build the lodge to live inside of, although not always. So it's worth pointing out that if a beaver doesn't need to do all of that building, if the water is already deep enough, if they have a nice little bank den that they've dug into the side of a riverbank, that they won't necessarily build these structures. But it is a characteristic beaver thing. And then one other thing about them is that they're mostly crepuscular nocturnal, which means if you go out looking to observe beavers, that early morning or later in the evening is best, or if you have a good flashlight or some night vision, even better in the night, because that's when they perceive that they are the safest. So first, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about beaver coexistence at Potomac Valley Audubon Society, and then we're going to kind of zoom out and talk more just about conflict and coexistence with beavers in general. So the timeline for PVAS coexisting with beavers begins with educator and naturalist Amy Moore just wishing for beavers to live at PVAS. I was working at the Clifton Institute, which is in Warrenton, Virginia, and there were beavers there, and Amy was just wishing that there were beavers. And then in December of 2020, Amy contacted me, very excited to tell me that there were beavers at Stouffer's Marsh. And that was very exciting. These are some photos. So I immediately, Casey, Amy, and I went out to Stouffer's Marsh and started to investigate what the beavers were up to out at Stouffer's. I love any opportunity, excuse to get to the PVAS preserves, even though I live in Northern Virginia now. And so you can see that in the center photo on the top is the lodge that the beavers built at Stouffer's Marsh. I have not been back to Stouffer's since this was probably January of last year. So certainly they have made other changes since then, but you can see some of the trees that they chewed down and a little bit of damming that they were doing along the weir at the preserve. So we went out to this area, and I'll talk more about this concept in a little while, but basically what we determined was that yes, there are beavers there, but that the conflict was not so severe. Yes, it might have been a trouble for Casey, the land manager, but there was no risk of like flooding to the road. They were chewing down some of the planted trees, but as far as conflict goes that could be addressed, there wasn't that much that could be done at this site. And again, I'll get more into that. And then in spring of 2021, Amy texted me again. I believe she said, Allison, we need to talk. And I was very scared and I thought she was going to break up with me. But then she said, there's beavers at Cool Spring. And that was even more exciting. And the less exciting part of that was that they almost immediately began to dam up the culverts that run under Lloyd Road, and there was flooding on the road. And this is, of course, an example of a more severe conflict because there is human safety to worry about. There are the departments of transportation and the county and other agencies that need to get involved at this point. And so this was certainly more of a priority to address than the beaver activity at Stoffers. And so here are some of the pictures that I took when I went out to Cool Spring to see those beavers, or beaver, we didn't know for a little while. You can see on the bottom right, the lodge that they were building. Top right shows, of course, the flooding along the road, which is less of a safety concern if the water is not freezing, but even more of a problem when it is. You can see on the bottom left, this was the dam that they were building along those culverts. More tree chewing, and then Amy in the water checking her camera trap, which eventually taught us that there were a pair of beavers living at Cool Spring. And I was suspicious of that the whole time, just because of the extent of the activity that was happening at Cool Spring. So in November 2021, in order to address the flooding on the road, Casey and some helpers installed a DIY flow device. And I'm going to talk way more about what those are. But here, oh, actually, I moved the picture of it. So there's a small picture here, and I will show you a larger version of that in a little bit. Also, to address the tree chewing at Cool Spring, we had a little mini workshop / volunteer day so that volunteers could come learn about how to protect trees from beaver chewing and felling. And we wrapped, I believe, 26 trees that day in just a few hours. So thank you if any of those volunteers are on the call. Thank you so much. It took us, like I said, just a few hours to wrap a bunch of trees along the trail, trees that had been planted, priority native species, and they will be ideally set for many years. Those cages will be in place, the trees have room to grow, and they are beaver proofed. And then what the future of that looks like, time will tell. Maybe there's discussions of a new box culvert getting installed, some changes to the road. Those things are also in the works because some of these solutions, they are not always super long-term, but right now the flow device is keeping the water off the road, keeping everyone driving by on Lloyd Road safe. And so everything that's in place is working for now, and then addressing the longer term issues will come later. I just want to say here, thank you to PVAS for being an example of how to coexist with beavers. It is not always easy. It is not always intuitive. And just working with everyone at PVAS on this, it was such a pleasure to come back and to work together to figure out, okay, we value these beavers. We want to allow them to live on these preserves. What can we do to minimize the conflict for everybody? So thank you to PVAS. So now we're going to talk a little more broadly about human-beaver conflict. And the first thing that I have to throw out there is there actually a beaver problem? And I kind of alluded to this previously when I was talking about how we kind of assess whether or not at a site, if it's a really severe conflict that needs immediate kind of action, or if it's just that there might be some inconveniences for someone like Casey who's managing the land, but not much else that you can do about it. And so this is a question that I have to very delicately pose to also the landowners that I work with. Do you actually have a problem? Because as you all know, you're all nature lovers. Nature is always changing. And it's supposed to be always changing. And so I like to just kind of remind people that beavers are one of these animals that helps us to embrace the change, because sometimes, let's say a landowner, for example, they've been living on a property for decades, and all of a sudden beavers show up because their populations are increasing. And they know that something is different, and they know that beavers are there, and they're reaching out for help, and they're saying, I've got a problem, I've got a beaver problem. And So my first question is always this: do you have a problem? What is the problem? Because if your land is a little squishier in one spot, or a few trees have been taken down, is that something that you can live with? Is it something we can address? Or is it just something that you can accept and embrace because beavers are supposed to change the landscape? And so I also just like to throw up a definition here of human-wildlife conflict. And there's so many definitions of it. This one is that it's an interaction between a human and a wild animal that results in negative effects on either one of them on the other. And so this is a multiple species inclusive definition. It used to just be that we were concerned about the negative impacts on humans. This could go either way, it's reciprocal. And it's also worth saying here that if I put on my anthropology hat for a second, that human-wildlife conflict is in a lot of cases actually human-human conflict that just kind of manifests as issues with wildlife. But with beavers, and this is one of the reasons why I got just so interested in learning more about them, it really is human-wildlife conflict. These beavers, their behaviors have such an impact on the land. They can have such an impact on the people that are sharing space with them. They have so much agency in these interactions that it kind of is an example of human-wildlife conflict in that sense. And then this little kind of graphic here at the bottom just shows that we're really talking about a spectrum. So it's not a dichotomy, it's not conflict or coexistence. It's really anything along this spectrum that might include conflict, might include coexistence, could change day to day. The same, when I worked with monkeys, for example, the same farmer may have had conflict with monkeys in the morning and then was coexisting with them in the afternoon. And so I think we can sometimes think about these things in limited framed ways that kind of limit our ability to be accepting of, let's say, the change that beavers cause. I hope I didn't get too philosophical there and that made sense. So let's talk about what problems beavers actually do cause, because I want to make it very clear that I understand that beavers cause people problems. That is not to be denied. And the first one is that they chew down trees that people want for any number of reasons, because they're beautiful, because they provide habitat for the birds that people like to watch, or because people grow fruit to eat, any number of reasons why we all love trees. And then the second problem is flooding, which is of course caused by them either clogging up culverts that go under roads mostly, or if they are just turning a stream into a pond where someone doesn't want a pond. So those are the two main problems. And then what I've done here is, so if you look, sorry, this is kind of a boring slide, but stick with me. If you look on the left side of these tables, what you'll see is for each of these two problems, all of the options, as I see it, for managing those problems. So for tree chewing on the top, you can see that you could trap the beavers, which I'll just totally specify here means kill them. So lethal trapping. Relocation, which would mean trapping them and then moving them live. Accepting the tree loss, which is usually okay for people to an extent, but not always a popular option. And then protecting the trees. And there's a few different ways to do that. And then what I've done for each of those kind of approaches to the problem is assess whether or not they are legal, humane, effective in the short term, effective in the long term, and affordable. These are all things that, of course, people value. Some of those pieces more than others, depending on the individual and their values, their attitudes about wildlife. And then I have shown that protecting the trees is the only approach to the tree chewing problem that checks kind of all of those boxes along the top. And you can see, for example, so this is, I made this one for the state of Virginia, but West Virginia has the same laws. You'll see that live relocation of beavers is not permitted. So that's just not an option unless you wanted to break the law. Don't recommend that. Then of course, the lethal trapping option isn't always humane. There are, of course, more humane and less humane ways of trapping beavers. And then of course, effectiveness is important to landowners or land managers dealing with beaver issues. And some of the strategies only work in the short term, but not in the long term. And so that's something to think about when you're putting time and effort into implementing these strategies. And then of course, money is important to everyone. And so relocation which is not an option anyway, is also not very practical or cheap. And so anyway, I just assessed kind of all the options there. And then on the bottom, same thing for flooding. And instead of protecting the trees, the two things that are different there would be removing the dams, which is an option to address flooding. It is effective in the short term, but the beavers are going to rebuild those dams so fast, you won't believe it. And so the one in green at the bottom there is installing what's called a flow device, which is what PVAS did at Cool Spring. And I will talk more about those in just a moment. So let's just kind of jump into, so those two green approaches to the conflicts. I'm just going to talk a little bit more about each of those. So how to protect your trees. There are a few different ways to do that. You can wrap the trees with fencing material, which is pictured here. You can paint the trunks of the trees with a sand and latex paint mixture. Or if you're trying to protect a really larger area of trees and it doesn't make sense to target individual trees, some people do an exclusion fence, and that starts to get a little less practical, a little less affordable. And so as long as it's on the small enough scale, at Human-Beaver Coexistence Fund, we recommend wrapping with fencing. And so I've included a graphic here on how to do that. This is also what the volunteers learned when they came to the volunteer day at Cool Spring. So we use this type of, you can buy it in the garden center of like Lowe's, Home Depot, Tractor Supply. All the supplies are easily available and relatively very affordable. You of course have to think about which trees that you want to prioritize protecting. So thinking about distance of the trees to the water, thinking about species, thinking about just all of those factors, but understanding that beavers go a lot farther from the water than a lot of people think and target pretty much any species. There's not a single one that I can say, oh, beavers won't touch that. So then the second step is going to be to cut the fencing. And the key here is to make it long enough so that you can wrap around the entire circumference of the trunk with a good gap in between the trunk and the fence. So we say anywhere between 6 and 12 inches. The bigger the fencing, the longer that strategy is going to continue to be effective. We're talking years and years of never having to worry about these trees that have been wrapped. And it just takes a few minutes for each one. And then of course you secure the seam after you wrap it. You secure the base of the fencing with some landscape pins so that beavers cannot push up and underneath the fence. And you make sure that your fencing material is at least 4 feet tall or 4 feet tall, because if you live in an area that gets any snow at all, I can raise up the height that a beaver is able to chew. And so those are the quick tips for how to wrap trees and protect them from beaver chewing and felling. Oh, and then the picture down here on the bottom left is a great picture of what not to do. This was at Cool Spring, and it just shows how if you wrap the fencing too tightly to the tree, the beavers will chew right through it. And that's also why we recommend the 14 gauge wire, because anything less than that, beavers can actually either bend it or chew right through it. So just making sure you have the right materials is cannot be overstated how important that part is. And so for the flooding problem, flow devices are the things that are going to lower the water level and allow beavers to remain on the landscape doing what beavers do. And you may have heard flow devices referred to as beaver deceivers, beaver baffles, caster masters. There are so many different names, fun, cute names for these devices. but I just kind of use the umbrella term flow device. And you can kind of break that down into two different types. So you'll see here on the left, the culvert protector type of flow device is what is going to keep beavers from damming up a culvert. If you think about this from the beaver's point of view, a culvert is just a leak in an already functioning dam. It's a little hole and they think, this is going to be great. I can just plug up this one little hole and all the water is going to back up and I'm going to have a great pond. So protecting culverts becomes a very important thing when it comes to coexisting with beavers. And it's pretty simple to do. Once again, it involves these pretty simple materials. One of the designs, so there's many different designs for any type of flow device, but one of the really popular ones for protecting culverts is this trapezoidal or keystone shaped fencing that what it does is can you all see my cursor when I move it? Yes, okay, great. So once a beaver hears this water, the fence protector has been installed, beavers are still going to hear the water flowing through this culvert. They're going to sense the water moving, and their instinct is going to be to start to dam really close to the opening of the pipe. So right along these edges of the fence. And then as they dam along the fence here, they're getting pushed farther and farther away from where the water is flowing through. And the goal, of course, is that they eventually just give up. They realize that it's not an ideal place to dam. And they either stay there with the water level as is, or they'll move to another spot. Which brings up another point. Even when you install a flow device and you put in the time and the effort and the money to do that, they don't always stick around. So maybe your problem is solved, but you just had a little sunk cost there. So then on the right is the pond leveler design of the flow device. And once again, you'll see lots of variations on this design if you get into learning about flow devices at all. But the general idea here, so it can go through a culvert, you could have a pond leveler, or it can go straight through a beaver dam. So I was at a site recently out in Rappahannock County, Virginia, where beavers are just damming along the Rush River, and it's very close to there's a road in a floodplain, and the river is rising up to the level of the road. There's no culvert to protect here. It's just a really large beaver dam. And so what would be installed in that case is something like this pond leveler, where you have a pipe that's going through the dam. So you do have to destroy up until kind of where you want the water level to be of the dam. And then you cage this end of the pipe and you sink it down in the water. Once again, so beavers, you're kind of moving that source of water away from the dam, and you're preventing them from being able to dam it up even if they do find it. And so you can see, this is the one that was installed at Cool Spring. Shout out to KC, they did a great job. It's still functioning as I understand it. There hasn't been any flooding on the road since they put in this device. But here are two of the pipes that go under Lloyd Road. And this is kind of the intake of that pipe. And it has prevented the road flooding from the point that it was installed. So awesome job on that. And I will talk about the flow devices. So there are companies that will do this. One example is Ecotone Inc., which is based in Maryland. They will come into parts of West Virginia and Virginia also to do this type of work. It is a little pricey when you have the experts coming in to do it. And a lot of people at that point decide to take the DIY approach, which is what PVAS did. And that is absolutely awesome. There is the problem of people installing a do-it-yourself version of these devices that when it doesn't work, they kind of spread the word that no flow devices work. And so my only concern, the only thing that I like to discuss with landowners when it comes to flow devices is if you're going to do this yourself, it's going to be very affordable, but know that there's going to be a little bit of problem solving involved. There's got to be a willingness to kind of tweak the design as you go, and you'll learn over time what works and what doesn't work. There's a little bit of maintenance. There's a little bit more of an investment of figuring out how your device works at your site. And there's professionals all over the country that are doing this type of work. They've been doing it for decades, and they still say that they learn something new at every site. So if this is your first flow device ever that you've installed, just know that it might take some tweaking. It's a process, it's a learning process, and to not hurt the coexistence cause by saying that all flow devices don't work after experiencing one flow device that doesn't work. So that's the only kind of concern with that approach. Although I totally encourage landowners to give it a try, just know what to expect going into the process. And then if this is something, this is just a little plug here for a program called Beaver Core. It's by the Beaver Institute. And if you know anyone who is interested in learning more about this stuff in like professional context, this organization, Beaver Institute, trains people how to build and install flow devices. And then they're sent out to wherever they are in the country to help with this kind of work. So it's a great program, and I just wanted to mention it in case anyone is interested. So that brings us to kind of the cultural issues surrounding human-beaver coexistence. And we've talked a little bit about how kind of thinking, is there a problem, and thinking about change as just part of the natural process. Change isn't necessarily bad. Change doesn't necessarily lead to a conflict. The other thing that we can do to change kind of our own attitudes about beavers is to learn more about their behavior, which all of you are already doing because you are here tonight. As you can imagine, learning about these animals, learning about why they do what they do, when they do what they do, so the seasonal patterns to beaver behavior, all of these things are going to make it easier to coexist because you understand the animal better. And then another thing we can do is to just think about the terms that we use to describe these animals. So I have heard pest and nuisance beaver and all of these terms that just have a really negative connotation, and I think take away from the benefits, which we will talk about in just a second, to coexisting with beavers. And so thinking of reframing the way that we think about our own relationship to beavers. Are they only causing us problems, or can we think about that relationship in a different way? And Glynis Hood wrote, she is I think ecologist, she's a beaver researcher who also wrote a book for the general public, and she wrote that humans simply do not like to be outdone by a rodent. And I really do think that there's something to that. You know, we live with mice in our houses sometimes, we live with rats in our cities, and sometimes we live with beavers in our backyard, but it's a little hard to take when a rodent is just changing so much of what we expect the land to look like. So that's kind of more on the cultural side of this conflict coexistence spectrum, but I like to bring it up. So just a little bit more here about the Human-Beaver Coexistence Fund. Last year, I started this organization because, like Krista said, when I was working at the Clifton Institute, I was observing this pair of beavers, learning all about them for the first time, and realizing that people need help learning more about them, learning what to do when they are causing problems. And there were other organizations around the country doing this type of work, but nothing right here in the Mid-Atlantic. And so that's why I started HBCF. We incorporated in June of last year, and our mission is to literally help landowners do what I have just described here, providing the resources, financial support through a cost share program, and of course, education and outreach. So just supporting people in coexisting with beavers. And our geographic focus is in this region, Virginia, West Virginia, Maryland, and DC, and hopefully eventually expanding a little beyond that to other states that aren't served by some of these other organizations that are also in the Mid-Atlantic region. Okay, why does all of this matter? Why should I put in time and money and effort to live with these beavers who are causing me problems? This is the why of it all, really. Beavers and their behaviors and the structures that they build provide many benefits, and I've kind of broken it down here. So their ponds help to replenish aquifers, store groundwater, and although it's kind of counterintuitive because they create flooding on a small scale, they really help to mitigate flooding on a larger landscape scale because they're slowing down the flow of water in a watershed. They stabilize the water table and provide just drought proofing for a landscape. So all that water that from the ponds, which are constantly growing, getting deeper, the beavers are digging canals, which are bringing water to places that maybe weren't so wet before. This leads into the benefit that they help to slow, sometimes extinguish wildfires, but also provide these wet refuges for animals who otherwise wouldn't be able to escape a wildfire. And of course, they provide habitat for so many other species, increasing biodiversity, even when they kill things like trees, so their ponds drown trees. And that, of course, provides habitat for all of the bugs and beetles and grubs that live in dead trees, and food for the woodpeckers. And so you can see how even some of the ways that they are destroying the landscape is also contributing to it. Their dams act as basically water filters. So they're filtering sediment and pollutants, reducing silt, reducing erosion, and overall just improving water quality and restoring streams. Out west is big right now on actually using beavers as a restoration tool to restoring a lot of these really eroded, degraded streams. And then even their foraging behavior, although again, they are taking down lots of plants, it's promoting new growth. Their channels that they dig are providing habitat. And so this is not even the full list of the benefits that beavers provide. I had a fascinating conversation with someone just the other day. If you'll remember at the very beginning, I said not all beavers build these dams and build these pond complexes, because there are, for example, beavers on the Potomac, beavers on the Shenandoah that don't need to build a dam. They can't build a dam. The water flow is too strong. And even in their own ways, they are contributing to some of these benefits. So I thought that was a fascinating question. River beavers versus the stream to pond beavers. And then I'm going to get a little less scientific with you here for a second. It is my own value that beavers provide all of these benefits to all of these other species, including us. But I also believe that they are inherently valuable, that they are worthy of coexisting with us, regardless of all of those benefits. I like to think sometimes about my relationship with beavers in a slightly different way. And so I collect their chewed sticks and little wood chips, and I crochet wall hangings, and I call it my caster craft collab. So it's my creative partnership with beavers. And it's just another way, it's the little side project I have to, like I said, just create art with beavers, and also just to have something to hang on the wall that people can use as a talking piece, learning more about beavers and that sort of thing. And I'm going to give a plug for BeaverCon, which is a conference that's happening in June. If you cannot get enough of tonight's presentation and you want to go learn about beavers for 3 days, it is happening not too far away in Hunt Valley, Maryland. You can go to beavercon.org to learn more, register for that conference. I actually met one of the board members that's now on my board at BeaverCon in 2020. It's a really great time, and I'm on the planning committee, so I had to just do a plug here. And then I also want to do a plug for iBeaver, which is a great community science thing, so that any one of you on the call, if you come to beaver activity, a beaver habitat on a hike, I don't know if I put Cool Spring and Stoffers on here yet, actually. You can use this app to report your observations, and then they get uploaded into this lovely map called Caster Mapper. And then you can see where beavers have been spotted all over the country. And so it's a fun community science beaver tool, which you are all very encouraged to use. It's so user-friendly. You can see some examples down here. You do not have to be a beaver biologist to understand and report these things. So there are pictures, and it's very user-friendly and fun. So that's iBeaver. And then I always love to recommend books in my talks because I am a book nerd. And on the right are all my favorite kids beaver books, and on the left are all my favorite grown-up beaver books. And so if you want to learn more, these are my suggestions. And then just to wrap up, I'm happy to take questions in a minute. I just want to say that humans and beavers have been coexisting for like thousands and thousands of years. And there are challenges to coexistence for sure, but we're heading in the right direction. We are coexisting more successfully now than we were certainly during the fur trade. The population of beavers is increasing. And I think the more people that understand the benefits of sharing space with the beavers, we can do even better. You don't have to call yourself a beaver believer. You don't have to think that they're cuter than otters, which they obviously are. But we can respect the fact that they are these resilient and just incredible creatures that change the landscape. They're already coexisting with us in that way. So how can we give that back to them? And just try a little harder to not jump to trapping as an option. So that wraps up my presentation. And you can follow HBCF on social media. We would love that at Coexist with Beavers. We're on Facebook and Instagram, and our website is coexistwithbeavers.org. And that's it. I'm going to wrap up and check the chat now for questions. Let's see. Or feel free to unmute yourself. That is also an option. I've got some questions here.
Let me know if you need some help, Allison. That was excellent. Thank you.
Thanks, Krista. Are snapping turtles predators for beaver kits? That is a great question. I haven't heard of that, but I would also not be surprised if I did hear it. Beaver kits are probably, by the time they actually leave the lodge and start learning to swim, they're probably a little bigger than most of snapping turtle prey, but that's a good question. I don't know for sure. Let's see. How do they know which way the tree will fall? Oh, this is a can of worms. So there are some people who believe that they don't know which way the tree is going to fall. And there are some people who just know that they know which way the tree is going to fall. And I think that, like with all things, the truth is somewhere in the middle. I think that I certainly believe that they chew strategically so that they are trying to make it easier for themselves, expending less effort to move the tree once it falls. So they do. It's in the way that they so they stand at a tree and they turn their head to the side and they just start taking chunks out of it when their intention is to take down the whole tree. And so they do that in such a way that it often does. There's studies about this, about like what percentage of trees actually fell toward the water. So I think beavers can. I think they don't always, but I think they can. And it's just about taking the chunks out at the right side of the tree at the right time. But I do definitely think that they know, like, where's the water? Where am I chewing? All that good stuff. So, but ask different people, you'll get different answers, I think. Let's see.
Yeah.
Beaver books. I can pull that slide back up. And Krista, if you want to read
Okay.
other questions while I'm doing that.
Okay. Yeah.
Letting me.
I'm trying to pull the chat here. So you're re-showing the suggested beaver books, so you can leave that slide up for a minute. Great question, because those look like really good books. The next question by Mary Duke is, how long does it usually take a beaver to cut down a tree that is approximately 12 inches across?
12 inches across, so 12-inch diameter trunk. A beaver could do that in one night, for sure. I think it would take maybe a few hours. I know sometimes, and as you can see, if you've ever hiked where there are beavers, sometimes they take a chunk out of a tree and then they don't come back for weeks. I don't always understand what their thinking is there, but if they want to, they can take down a pretty big tree in just a few hours. It depends on the kind of tree and if the beaver's working together or working alone, but quicker than you would think is the answer.
Yeah, sounds like that. Then Pete's asking, do beavers stay in the same lodge or place or move their territory?
Okay, I just realized I can see the chat while I'm sharing my screen, so that's great. Okay. So beavers will stay. So a colony, like I said at the very beginning, consists of a mated pair of beavers and then their offspring. And so a colony like that, so one mated pair, ideally would stay, if it's a good habitat, they would stay in the place for years and years in the same pond complex, I would say. They build new lodges periodically. So the beavers that I know the best, they built a new lodge, I would say about every 6 months. But what's notable about those beavers is that they did not have to maintain a big dam. They were living in a man-made pond. So they're not going to stay in this exact same lodge forever. I can imagine it gets kind of gross in there. They just eventually want to move on and build a fresh lodge, which they do. But they'll stay in the same area for years. A lot of people think that they're going to just exploit all of the resources in one area and then have to move. But that really doesn't that doesn't happen as quickly as people think it does. And remember that beavers also are just encouraging new plant growth. So in some ways, they're almost like farming different parts of their habitat and knowing when new things are growing, and then maybe making the pond deeper or building canals so that they can forage farther out from the pond. And eventually they could reach a point where they need to just move and find new habitat. I hope I answered that one. Let's see. Are there other ways beyond caging trees to dissuade beaver? Let's see, land. Wow, you've wrapped 200 trees. That's very impressive. Beaver marching 75 yards up a steep hill. I have read about applying like some sort of solution that has, what is it? The peppery stuff that they don't like the taste of. The trick with that is that you have to just reapply it. I mean, anytime it rains, you're going to be applying that to a bunch of trees. I might in this case, and I don't know, James, the specifics of your property, but you might be a candidate for some exclusion fencing, just to kind of keep them out of that whole area along the hill. And I'm not sure what the surrounding habitat is like if you were to fence off the place where the erosion is the biggest problem. But thank you for coexisting and keeping trying. You're proving my point that it's like live and learn and do something different, and every single property has slightly different problems. So that's part of the fun of it. Why do beavers cut down trees? Why do they cut down trees that are too large for them to move? That is a great question. So in a lot of cases where beavers are chewing down those really big trees that we think that they could never drag that thing to the water, at the point that it's fallen, they're just going to remove smaller branches that they can take away from the tree. So even if they have never have any intention of moving an entire tree, they're still bringing all of those smaller branches down to a place where they can use them. So the paint solution, yes. So the paint is trickier. It doesn't have to be reapplied as quickly as that like pepper solution that I was talking about. But when the tree grows, it does kind of crack it much faster than you would have to fix like a fencing issue, which is why I recommend fencing over painting. Because as soon as, if there's a little spot, so what the paint with the sand and the latex does is the beavers don't like that sensation of chewing, but as soon as there's a crack in the paint from the tree growing, they're gonna get in there and chew it. Let's see. No one wants to unmute, huh? I feel like I'm talking to to nobody. Okay, let me see. A comment. Yes, Jim, great comment. Beaver fur trading is associated with out west, but certainly started here in the east. And I would say it was always kind of based economically here on the East Coast. So that is a really great point. And actually, if you're interested, well, let me see. Once they were hats, this book by Frances Backhouse that's on the slide, that one does a great job of talking about like the history of the fur trade. And are there any other questions? Let's see. How old do the young have to be before they can start chewing trees? So kits are born every they're born in the spring, and then they do spend a few weeks, a couple of months in the lodge, just nursing. And then they do start to, at a few months old, they will start to leave the lodge, learn how to swim, and then almost immediately start learning how to chew. They do learn from the adults, and they start foraging on their own. And so, yeah, a few months old. In the summer, you'll start to already see kits coming out, and they will also have the yearlings, so the beavers from the previous year, that also help to care for the kits. And there's some social learning going on there for sure, for learning how to chew and what to eat and that sort of thing. Casey, yes, you're talking about paint at Stoffers. If you want to chime in here, because you've been seeing the effects of it more frequently than I have.
Yeah, Casey, do you have any comments about what you've seen and done at Stoffers or Cool Spring?
No, I mean, Allison has done an amazing job telling the story. There was a lot more politics on the back end, working with DOH and but yeah, when we went in to do our homemade beaver deceiver, it was we knew we were getting into territory that we were unfamiliar with, and we weren't sure it was going to work. We had no guarantee. It was an investment and a gamble, and Jim Cummins, our president, came up with the great design that ended up working for us, and he even had to get in the freezing cold water a week later to tweak it a little bit, and we anticipate we will have to get in there eventually and clean out inside the caging and what have you, just to keep up the maintenance. But like Allison was alluding to, it's probably a short-term solution, and we have more in the works. But that's all I'll say about that for the time being. I did add a photo to the chat of our beaver deceiver since the beavers dammed around the fencing, which Allison was describing, but it can be kind of hard to imagine what that actually looks like. So the beavers detect the water flowing out through the culverts, and that's what triggers them, like, oh my God, must stop this. And so they continue to do their damming around the fencing, but that's okay as long as they don't dam around the inflow of the deceiver pipe. So it's only around the outflow, and it lets them have their pond. It lets us have all those ecosystem benefits to the marsh without the road flooding. So it's keeping the water about a foot down off the road. So
thank you, Casey, and thank you, Jim. Awesome work.
Yes, and Bob Dean for coming out on his birthday to install the beaver deceiver.
That's awesome.
Hey, Bob. I have another comment. This is Jim. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
It's about the question about they're cutting down these big trees or chewing down these big trees. Well, they don't climb trees very well, and they're eating the bark on the trees. They don't eat the wood. They eat the outer bark. And when they cut a tree down, they can eat the outside sort of the tree and those branches that you mentioned earlier. But the other thing they're doing is that shoots are going to come up from those trees that they cut down, and they're really they're foresters. Beavers, they're silviculturists. They're doing stuff, and they're doing a fairly unique thing called a coppice silviculture. Coppice silviculture is what humans used to do to make handles and stuff. They would cut trees down, they'd send out shoots, and then people would harvest those shoots to make handles. Well, the beaver are doing the same thing. Well, before humans needed the handles, they were doing that. So they have the shoots, and they eat the bark off of those shoots. So that and after a while, they'll eventually have to move the dam and go to another place and start their silviculture in another area. But that's why they're cutting down the trees. Another reason they're cutting down the trees is so they put up all these shoots that they can also live on. So I just wanted to add that.
Thanks, Jim. And I'll add a third reason. They've got to keep those teeth in check. So some people wonder why they're, sometimes you observe that they're chewing, but they haven't taken the whole tree down, or they haven't seemed to gain anything from it. But those incisors are always growing, so they have to chew even for that reason.
Nice. Allison, James Miller is wondering why they go past pawpaw and ailanthus to get to the oaks.
So I have seen them take down pawpaw and ailanthus. So that could be a preference of those particular beavers. But I do think they prefer oaks over those other two species. But yeah, every beaver is different, and I have seen them eat all three of those species.
Yeah.
And they eat autumn olive. So yep, Amy said they do eat multiple invasive species, which is a good thing unless they're just promoting new growth like Jim was just explaining.
Yeah.
If anyone wants to follow the beavers around with herbicide, that would be ideal.
Well, even if they stimulate new growth, they're still preventing
Seed.
the mature plants from going to seed. So I'll take it.
True.
Yeah. Susan is saying that she wanted you to talk about their practice of splashing their tails to scare other animals away.
Yes. So the tail slap, it's one of the most fun and compelling beaver facts that I share with children, because I have us all make the sound of a beaver tail slap, and they get to clap as loud as they want. It's very fun. But like you saw in the silly meme at the beginning, the water whacker, the beaver tail, is used for multiple things. In addition to swimming, it's thought that when they slap their tails on the surface of the water, that it, number one, is potentially going to spook or scare a predator away, or to just call attention so that the predator knows that the beaver is there and watching it. But the second function of the tail slap is to actually alert any of the other beavers in the colony that there's danger nearby. And so I have read, I forget where I read this, I'm so sorry. I have read that female beavers have the loudest and most effective tail slap. And that when a male beaver tail slaps, maybe the kits respond, but when a female tail slaps, everyone just dives under the water, heads to the lodge. So that's another fun tail slapping fact.
Right.
But if you haven't, so I have mixed feelings because I've heard them myself multiple times. It does mean that I'm causing stress to the beaver, that I'm maybe too close for comfort. I don't necessarily want to make a beaver tail slap. But if you do happen to hear one, it's really cool. The first time I heard it, I was shocked at how loud it was. Just like something huge, just like plopping into the water. So.
Cool, very cool. Bernie's question, do you see the last question?
Oh yeah, Canadensis. I'm guessing it means from Canada. I don't actually know the answer to that. That
Yes.
is, okay, thanks Casey. Yeah. Castor from Canada.
So many flower names. Bernie knows all the flowers, so.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
My Latin is not so good. but. And then castor feber, which is the Latin name in for the Eurasian beaver, just makes me think it's, referring to their fur. So.
Yeah. Well, this has been absolutely amazing. It's just so close to home because obviously 2 of our preserves are experiencing this, and it's really exciting. And I know Amy is thrilled, and she called them she's proud of them, and they're her little weed warriors. I know Casey has dealt with more of the politics of it all. So she has a different angle on it, but it's so exciting, and it was educational to hear what you had to say, informing us about some of the bigger picture of how other places are dealing with them as well. We're not alone.
Mhm.
So I would just want to make sure and thank you. This was really exciting, and I hope you continue to walk this journey with PBIS as we go along. Does anyone else have any other questions you want to unmute and shout out or add to the chat? Otherwise, I think we might be closing for the evening.
I'll put a plug out there for future volunteers because we're likely going to do a secondary beaver deceiver come spring at Stouffer's Marsh. When Allison first visited us, we weren't at a level where we needed a flow mitigation device, but things have changed. Like she was saying, it's always changing. So now we're reaching the point where we were. So if anybody's interested in ever getting to kayak out onto Stouffer's Marsh, this is your one and only opportunity to get to do that, is to help come install the beaver deceiver.
Yeah.
I want to come.
Sounds
So
good.
we will have more information about that as we get closer to that opportunity, and I will make sure to alert the general public about it. Okay, excellent. Well,
Thanks,
this is
everyone.
Thank
yeah,
you.
thank
Wonderful.
you.
Thank you so much.
Really interesting.
Thanks, Allison. It was great.
Great program. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Very good job.
Thank you.